So welcome again to June Business-Wise Insiders. Most of you here are probably familiar with how it works, but just as a refresher, I'm going to walk everyone through a brief presentation, which would take about 20 minutes, during which I'll keep everyone on mute to minimize any inadvertent disruptions. And then, as Deborah mentioned, after the presentation, we'll have a breakout discussion where you'll have a chance to introduce yourself, ask questions, share your own ideas on today's topic with some of our wise guys, as well as other attendees. And this is really the best part of Business-Wise Insiders, having that discussion and exchange of ideas, because whereas talking to you in one direction is all well and good, sharing ideas is how we really build knowledge and make connections. You can also always ask questions in the chat window, and if we don't get to those during the presentation, we'll be sure to touch on it in the breakout discussion. So for today's topic, we're going to dig into email subject lines, including key subject line strategies that you can use to generate more opens, conversations, and appointments. But as I just alluded to, this presentation is really about more than just subject lines. This may sound a little weird to say at the beginning of a presentation about subject line strategies, but subject lines really aren't that important. Of all the things that sales reps should focus on for effective business development, subject lines are pretty far down the list. However, as I'll explain in a moment, they occupy, they occupy a unique position in cold prospecting and can offer some really helpful insights into the fundamental principles that drive a successful business development strategy. So let's start with the reason subject lines are important. And when we're talking about email prospecting, that act of sending cold emails to new prospects with the goal of starting conversations, setting appointments, this is sort of the nightmare scenario. No matter how good your message is, it can't resonate with your prospect. It can't start a conversation or lead to an appointment if your prospect never sees it, because he or she never opens it. And in that regard, your subject line serves as a kind of biz dev choke point that can make or break an email prospecting strategy. I don't think anyone would argue that your list, your offer, and the way your message is written are all far more important than the handful of words in the subject line. But that doesn't change the fact that a bad subject line can blow up the whole deal. Even if you have an ideal focused list of high-value prospects, a compelling offer of value that gives prospects a reason to act, and a skillfully written email that effectively communicates that offer, if you have a bad subject line, it can all end in your prospect hitting delete before they ever see the fruits of your hard work. And of course, there are a number of factors that determine whether your prospect opens your message, including when they receive it and how cluttered their inbox is at that moment. We've all been guilty of triaging our inboxes at those busy moments, and even emails with really good subject lines can get caught up in that tide. Cold email is also a numbers game. We're strangers reaching out to prospects, trying to start a conversation leading to a sale, hopefully, so we know we're not going to make a connection every single time. But your subject line still has outsized influence, and for that reason, it's worth understanding the factors that make subject lines successful or not to maximize the odds of making those connections. And then one final distinction here before we get into the substance of the presentation. There are a number of different kinds of email lead generation, and the rules for subject lines can vary pretty widely between them. But in the world of B2B sales, there are two main categories. There's email marketing, which is more of an advertisement for your company or brand, or geared towards specific kinds of content or events. And then there's email prospecting, where sales reps are seeking to make one-on-one connections and set first-time appointments with prospects. And since the vast majority of sales reps here are engaged to a far greater degree in the latter, in email prospecting, that's where our focus will be today. How to write effective subject lines for prospecting emails where you're trying to make that human connection and start conversations. Deb, did you have any intro remarks you wanted to offer at this point?
Well, I would just say that while many of the retailers might disagree with me, there's certainly a big difference between the relationship that we're trying to create with our prospects and the ones that a retailer might be trying to connect with us to buy something. And so when we think about subject lines, for me, it's kind of like that pickup line when we're looking for our next relationship.
Thanks, Deb. And I think when we were preparing for this, you mentioned something that's really important too. In addition to the subject line, email marketing messages might come from the business itself. You might get a message that says from BusinessWise. Cold prospecting, cold email prospecting, you're getting a message from an actual person. You're seeing their name on your screen with that first initial subject line, and creating that human connection makes all the difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So let's look at our first secret to subject lines that stand out in your prospects' inboxes. Be relevant and offer value. And there are a couple of reasons I wanted to start here. The first is because this is probably the most important lesson with the most wide-ranging implications for your biz dev strategy. Regular insiders know we talk about the importance of offering value a lot, and it really infuses every aspect of how you make new connections with prospects. But secondly, I'm starting here because it's going to help us look at subject lines from a new perspective, not just as a gimmick for getting your prospect to open and read your email, but as an integrated part of your biz dev strategy that follows the same rules as all your other tactics. And when you think about it, every email is a transaction. This is especially true of cold emails where there is no prior relationship or additional context. If you want something from your prospect, a reply, you need to offer something in return, value to your prospect. So whether you call it a contract or a transaction or a two-way street, it's really important not to think of email as telling and selling. That is the idea that as soon as you tell your prospect about your great product or service, that you'll be able to sell it to them. Because your prospects won't care about or respond to your email if they don't get anything valuable in return. That's true of the subject line itself. If they don't feel like they're going to get value from opening the email itself, they're not going to. And regular insiders attendees have heard us talk about this a lot. We call it the 40-40-20 rule. And we talk about it in relation to all aspects of sales and lead generation to help us stay focused on the big picture. It's the idea that the vast majority of lead gen success, 80%, comes from two basic concepts: 40% from your list and 40% from your offer. Now, your email message and subject line, which we're going to be talking more about today, they live on the right side of this slide, the 20% that covers what you say and how you say it. But together with your list, what you're actually offering your prospects is much more important, because what they get in return is why they open and reply to your email in the first place. So let's look at a few real-world subject line statistics that help illustrate what I mean. And I want you to think about the degree to which each subject line hits on something that's relevant to the prospect. So the first two subject lines here are actually both from the same company. It's an accounting firm. And both subject lines perform pretty well, but the one on the left did especially well with an open rate of over 40%. And I think it's safe to say that taxes are relevant to every prospect, even if they don't always want to talk about them. So what makes one subject line more effective than the other? And I would argue that it comes down to value. The first subject line offers a sales tax workaround, while the second merely indicates that the sender wants to ask a question. So with the first, the prospect is getting something, and with the second, they're being asked for something. And as you would expect, that promise of value wins out in the form of more opens. And then on the right, the last subject line did not perform well. It's from a company that provides background screening for job candidates. But the subject line didn't do a good job of clarifying why that matters to the prospect and the value they might get from opening the email. So some key takeaways here are that you need to give in order to get. So hinting at the value you're offering in your email and how it's relevant to what your prospect cares about will in turn translate into more opens and replies for you. Moreover, especially in the subject line, you want to try to push that pain button. When you allude to the concerns and frustrations that are likely already on your prospects' minds, your subject line will be more likely to resonate. And then finally, think of your subject line as a sort of preview or summary of the email itself. And seen in that way, it's smarter to write your message first, then write your subject line. It's kind of like building a house. You want to start with a foundation rather than with the door. So how does this all translate into better biz dev skills? Well, we've already covered to some degree, but it's the idea that your offer of value is central to why prospects engage with you. I said earlier that cold email was a transaction. In reality, every single phase of the new business development process is a transaction where you offer value in return for your prospect acting. And the vast majority of those actions occur way before a sale, when they agree to take your call, open your email, reply to your message, start a conversation, set an appointment, so on. At every stage, the perceived value must outweigh the perceived cost in order to result in prospect action. And the ways you provide value are to frame your offer and your request in terms of how your prospect benefits from their perspective. They definitely don't care about your product's features. They care about the big challenges and day-to-day frustrations that keep them up at night. And they care about the goals and aspirations that they set for themselves in their business. So think really hard about what those are and orient your whole biz dev strategy toward being relevant to those prospect challenges and priorities. Deb, did you want to add anything here?
Yes, thanks, Sam. We also want to think about what the goal is of that message. And most often, it's to start a relationship, perhaps to have a meeting, or to develop some trust between you and your prospect, because they don't know you and they don't trust you at first. So we don't want to only focus on the value of the products and services that we're selling. We want to focus on the value that a prospect would get from establishing a relationship or meeting with us. What can they gain from knowing somebody new?
Exactly. These mini transactions that lead up to a sale shouldn't be thought of as a path to a sale. They should be thought of as transactions in and of themselves, because you know that if you can get them to the next phase, you're closer to a sale. But on their end, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about taking that step in front of them. And that's why they need to see value in exchange for that step. Okay, so we've covered the big key to successful subject lines, and now I'm going to home in on ways we can communicate that relevance and value more effectively. And for subject lines, it's really critical to be concise. And here are 3 stats that reinforce this point. These are not subject line response rates, but rather statistics about the length of your subject line. So we all obviously receive a lot of emails, and I'm sure you've already noticed that sometimes subject lines get cut off when they exceed a certain length. Well, it turns out that that length is fairly predictable. Most email clients cut off subject lines after 60 characters. And in some cases, the cutoff point is even sooner, because email clients will automatically insert the phrase external into the subject line of emails from outside your organization. So if you want your subject line to be read in full, it better be short, and the stats bear that out. Subject lines that are 41 characters or less have 21.8% open rates on average, while subject lines that are 61 characters or longer have an average open rate of just 16.8%. And that translates, 16.3%. And that translates to 25% fewer opens over the course of the campaign. So that's 25% fewer prospects who are seeing your message in the first place. And that's a really big difference. So let's look at some real world examples. These are all subject lines actually that we've used in our own automated email prospecting campaigns here at BusinessWise. And they all touch on the same basic issue: increasing prospect connections and avoiding missed opportunities. The subject line on the left is only 3 words. It's only 17 characters, and it performed much, much better, more than twice as high in terms of open rate as the other 2. And it's worth pointing out here that on the subject lines on the right, we've chosen to personalize by including the company name, which can be effective, but can also make your subject line longer, especially if the name of the company is relatively long. So you can see that just that idea of truncating it and delivering the same pain point in a shorter package leads to a much higher open rate. So it's clear how being concise can impact the effectiveness of a subject line, but how does that translate to other areas of your biz dev strategy? Well, it comes down to the concept of friction. And that is that anything that serves to distract from the action you want your prospect to take will reduce the likelihood that they will take it. And that's true of extra and unnecessary words. So the more succinct you are, the more focused your prospect will be on the offer and action that you're asking for. You also want your prospect to obviously understand what it is you're offering and asking, and being concise often helps in that regard as well. And then finally, when you're talking, your prospect isn't. Obviously, you want to deliver insights and value, but you also want the conversation to be focused on, as we just mentioned, your prospects' problems and priorities. And when your goal is to focus on those challenges and priorities, being too lengthy, not being concise enough can be a big issue. Deborah, any thoughts on conciseness?
No.
So moving on to a related concept, and perhaps even more important than being concise, you need to be clear about what you're offering and what you're asking. If your prospect doesn't understand or has to work to understand what you're really saying, they won't act on it. And oftentimes, especially with cold email, there's this temptation to be overly clever. And it makes sense. Some of our favorite ad campaigns are really clever and funny, and they're the ones that stick in our minds as examples of effective marketing. And when executed well, that humor or cleverness can really stand out. What's more, gimmicky subject lines can actually deliver really good open rates. But when they're overly clever or gimmicky, they fail the clarity tests and are irrelevant to the substance of your message and fail to deliver good leads. So let's take a look at a few examples here. The subject lines on the left are certainly not very clever, but they give you a pretty good idea of what's inside the email. And if selling your business or lowering insurance rates or scheduling your next trash or recycling pickup are things that are on your mind as a business owner, then there's a good chance you'll open and read it. In contrast, the subjects on the right could be basically about anything, and they could seriously backfire. Think about it. If you get an email with the subject line urgent, and it's about selling you commercial HVAC services, are you going to be inclined to respond? And then the ways this translates into more successful biz dev writ large, once again, we're looking to reduce friction, to reduce the amount of work your prospect has to do to understand and take the action you want. Relatedly, the industry jargon that we've all become familiar with can be a real drag on clarity, because even though you understand some of those terms, your prospect may not. So always err on the side of using common, easy to understand language. And then finally, as I've already touched on, your goal is to strike a nerve, to push a pain button. And if your message isn't clear, it won't hit that mark quite as hard. Anything from you here, Deb?
It makes a lot of sense, and I would just caution for those of you that use marketing experts, that marketing is a very broad area of expertise, and you really want to make sure that someone that's helping you with your email has a lot of experience in email copy, because it's very, very different than other kinds of marketing.
Right, that clear versus clever. Oftentimes people are approaching email the same way they would approach writing copy for a website or for a brochure or for an ad, when clearly the mode of communication in email is quite different, and you're trying to strike a different tone. So as Deb mentioned, you need different language, and clarity is key. So on to our final key to subject line success, and this may seem counterintuitive, but I'll explain more in a moment. You want to be boring. We just talked about the fact that you don't want your email to seem like it's coming from a clever, gimmicky marketer. So what's the opposite of a clever, gimmicky marketer? It's a regular, boring human being, maybe even one that the prospect already knows. And remember, we're talking about email prospecting, not even email marketing. Your goal is to create a one-on-one human connection. And in order to maximize your chances for success, you need to sound like a human. So let's take a look at some real world stats again. So here's that same subject line from the previous segment, trash recycling pickup at company. Again, not clever, pretty boring. And it delivered an open rate of nearly 70%. So why? It's because it's routine, it's pedestrian, and it's related to an everyday problem that's on a business owner's mind. Another good one was office equipment question for first name. It's mundane. It uses the prospect's first name to create a feeling of familiarity, and it generated an open rate of over 35%. And then on the other end of the spectrum, on the right, is an email from a recruiting service. It's not very clear. It's definitely a bit gimmicky since the sender isn't even the one who wants to apply for the job. But the main pitfall here, to my eye, is that every word is capitalized. And how many actual humans do you know who write like that? I would encourage you to think about or even look at your email inbox just through the lens of what the subject lines look like on the screen. The ones that you go to first are the ones that look like they're coming from a person who needs a fairly immediate response. And if it's written like it comes from a marketer, you're not going to respond. So of course, in the world of B2B sales, where relationship building is so important, your humanness as a sales rep is also paramount beyond subject lines and emails. So once again, eliminate the jargon and the marketing speak. It can be hard, but aim to write like you talk in a conversational and professional manner. To get a little more scientific, regular insiders may remember Dr. Robert Cialdini's 6 principles of persuasion, those mental shortcuts that people use to help determine what actions to take. And research has shown that people prefer to say yes to those they like and are familiar with. And then finally, you bring unique insights and ideas to the table based on your own experience and expertise. That uniqueness is reinforced by your humanness and your interpersonal skills, and you should infuse those into all of your biz dev channels and strategies to the best of your ability. Anything here, Deb?
I want to remind everyone, as you were saying, Sam, to be mindful of your successes. So when you open an email from someone you didn't know, go back and remind yourself, what did that subject line say? Think about it. What was it that compelled you to open it rather than to delete it? And try and use those successes as you mount your email campaigns or individual emails. And, you know, we have to kiss a lot of frogs before we find our prince. So this is a challenge. It's an ongoing one. Something that might have been successful last year won't be successful now, but keep focusing on the successes.
That's a great point, and actually reminds me of something that I wanted to raise, which is that obviously there's a lot going on here. Your subject line is this tiny little box. We're telling you to use as few words and characters as possible, but we're also telling you to be clear and be human and strike a nerve. And it's really hard to do all of those things in such a compressed little space. What's more, we look at these statistics, and some of them are really great and some of them aren't, but they're not that much different. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly why, in certain cases, the subject line did well or didn't. There's a bunch of things happening at the same time in a very small space in a short amount of time. So the best you can do is try your best to hit all of these points. Don't beat yourself over the head when you don't, and go back and look at your successes and failures, as Deb said, and how you respond to the things you get to inform your strategy going forward. This is a continuous learning process, and the more you do those things, the higher likelihood you are to succeed at your goal of making those prospect connections. And with that, I wanted to end the presentation just by going over a few more real-world results and maybe some tips that you can take away and try, experiment with, and we'll do what I just said, which is take a look at some subject lines and see why we think maybe they did well or didn't, and try to take those lessons forward. So here are 3 subject lines that performed extremely well. The first one is again about taxes, which we've already mentioned is always relevant, so it does well on that count. But it's also very human and conversational in a way that most tax-related emails probably aren't. So I think it checks the humanness box as well. And obviously the results speak for themselves, an open rate of over 65%, which is terrific. The second subject line here is from a creative branding agency. And you'd think that more than any other business, they'd be tempted to be clever and gimmicky, but it does a really good job of staying concise, not getting overly gimmicky, something like take your brand to the next level, and conveying a real human conversational feel. So it makes sense that it did pretty well. And then finally, we have a subject line for a virtual reality team building service, which does a really good job of being extremely clear. You have a good idea of what you're going to be reading about when you open this email. And if you're an HR manager looking for new team building ideas, you're likely to open it. So this slide presents more of a mixed bag. The one on the left is obviously more toward the gimmicky end of the spectrum, but it got great results, over 50%. And I think in the right context, if this is the subject line for a follow-up email, where you are just confirming that the issue you raised is a problem or a priority for your prospects, it can be effective, but you need to do it with a grain of salt and realize that this is not clear and may backfire for that reason. The one in the middle here, CEOs only, learn how others are winning. Not a very good response rate. I think there are a number of things that probably account for that fact. It's not clear what you're going to get when you open it. A little bit gimmicky, and by mentioning CEOs, you may be sort of innately preventing people whose title is not explicitly CEO from opening the email. So not a winner there. And then finally, we have another subject line from the same company that had the effective subject line from this slide. And instead of highlighting the VR team building aspect, it just says remote team building idea for company. Now, as Deborah pointed out when we were reviewing this, remote team building could mean basically anything. It could mean team building at a hotel next door. You don't know really what type of message you're going to be getting other than that it might be related to team building. So you could see the open rate was almost 40% lower. So finally, I just wanted to share 5 subject line ideas that I'm borrowing from Jason Bay of Outbound Squad. I really like Outbound Squad as a resource and would encourage anybody here to take a look at it if they're looking for new ideas. One of the big reasons I think it's valuable is they're really focused on the same thing that we are here at BusinessWise, which is sales reps sending cold outreach emails, making cold calls to individual prospects, trying to create those one-on-one connections so you can avoid some of the noise that comes along with typical B2B marketing stats, email lead gen stats. It's much more about sales prospecting done on an individual basis from human to human. So he has 3 ideas that he said has helped generate open rates of 35 to 65%. One of them is the rule of 3, where you take sort of 3 seemingly unrelated things from your email and just string them together in your subject line, which can make it more concise and sort of a different way of summing things up. And here he has the issue that he's trying to address, the name of the company, in this case, it's Tom's, and then the year he sent it, 2020. So that's one thing you could try. Another angle to try to hit is to be mysterious. So you want to create a little curiosity. So for example, his subject line would be, hi, first name, I was researching company and ... Obviously, that one works better in the context of a one-on-one outreach where you have done some research on the company rather than in an automated campaign where you might not have full knowledge of every company you're emailing. A third idea would try to be familiar, leveraging referrals or potential users. And again, this would be in the context of a one-off email to a prospect that you have on your maybe top 10, 25, top 50 list, where you say, hi, Scott, I was just talking to Deborah. You're leveraging that referrer as a way of getting in the door. The next is problem-centric, and we covered a few of these in the presentation today, where you just very briefly hit on a common problem. So utility overages or low conversions. I think the one that we used for our own campaign that performed so well was prospect reply rate. It really just succinctly hits the problem that might be on their mind, and gives them a reason for opening that's clear and hints at value inside. And then finally, and we've talked about this in various contexts before, combining email with voicemail. So in this context, it can be a great way to provide an idea for a subject line. So if you call first and you leave a voicemail, then your email can use the subject line, "Hey, Cynthia, just left a voicemail." But we're big believers, as much as we talked about some of these principles today, we're big believers in trying out different approaches, see what works for you, and going from there. It's, as I said, a continuous learning experience, and you never know what's going to work. And the rules of the road today might be slightly different tomorrow. So always worth trying something new. Well, thank you all again for attending, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment so we can have a short breakout discussion. And I encourage all of you to stick around. But thanks again for attending.